Hello everyone. This video explains how to use transactional session with Outbox enabled send-only endpoints in NServiceBus to achieve transactional consistency when modifying business data and sending messages. Often in your system, it's important to achieve consistency when modifying business data and sending messages. Within the context of a message handler, when an incoming message triggers the handler, it can be solved using the Outbox pattern. However, there may be other scenarios where you want to maintain consistency between sending messages and modifying business data outside the context of a message handler. For example, in an ASP.NET controller, where there is non-trivial processing logic in controllers, and moving into dedicated handlers would be a significant effort. The transactional session solved this problem for messages sent or published outside the context of a message handler. Transactional session can be used in an Outbox-enabled mode or without an Outbox. In this video, we will discuss the Outbox-enabled transactional session. When it comes to send-only endpoints in NServiceBus, they are used when the sole purpose is sending messages and no message processing is required. Consider an ASP.NET Core controller that requires sending messages and modifying business data to be atomic. With the new changes incorporated into transactional session version 3.3.0 onwards, it is now possible to treat your ASP.NET Core controller as a send-only endpoint and utilize transactional session to achieve transactional consistency. When used together with the Outbox in a send-only endpoint, the transactional session must be configured with a remote processor endpoint that will manage the Outbox on behalf of the send-only endpoint. Let us see a live demo. What I have here is an ASP.NET Core application that uses Entity Framework Core to save business data into a database and send a message. The message is processed by the receiver endpoint in the handler, where the message is processed and the business data is marked as processed in the database. The ASP.NET Core application is a send-only endpoint that uses transactional session to achieve consistency between modifying business data and sending messages. The controller uses the iTransactional session interface to send message as shown in line 21 and save business data into the database using Entity Framework Core. The endpoint is marked as send-only using endpoint configuration.sendonly API in program.cs. Transactional session is enabled using the enable transactional session API. This API expects an object of type transactional session options, where you can specify a processor endpoint. It is this processor endpoint that acts as the remote processor to manage the Outbox on behalf of this send-only endpoint, which is our ASP.NET Core controller. Let us look at the remote processor code, which is the transactional session processor project, as you can see in the solution. It is an NServiceBus endpoint and uses transactional session with Outbox enabled. It is expected that the remote processor endpoint is connected to the same database as the ASP.NET Core controller, which is our send-only endpoint, so that the remote processor can manage the Outbox for the send-only endpoint. The remote processor is treated as an infrastructure endpoint whose sole purpose is to manage the Outbox on behalf of the send-only endpoint. What does this mean? Let us go back into the docs and see where you can gather more information about this. When Outbox is enabled, transactional session sends a dispatch message before the database transaction is committed. It is this dispatch message that facilitates sending the outgoing messages stored in the Outbox storage. A send-only endpoint lacks processing capabilities. Therefore, the processing of the dispatch message needs to be done elsewhere. The remote processor assists with the processing of this dispatch message, which locates the Outbox record for message operations and dispatching them. Why remote processor? What are the design considerations and benefits? As mentioned in the docs, it provides us with predictable dispatch. Processing of dispatch messages will be more reliable since there is no risk of getting delayed behind slow business messages. We can also provide more accurate metrics and simplified management by the use of remote processor. What is the impact of this on the platform tooling? Before I show you that, let me run my endpoint. If I go into NServiceBus, as you can see, both my sample receiver, which processes the business message, as well as the remote processor can be monitored using NServiceBus. And when it comes to the usage data, in the usage tab, you can see that both the endpoints tracks the daily throughput. And using the new transactional session processor endpoint option, you can mark the processor endpoint to be as a remote processor endpoint, which excludes the throughput from the usage report. Thank you very much.